Ip Man, born in 1893 in Foshan, China, became the grandmaster who quietly transformed Wing Chun from a closely guarded family art into the most widely practiced kung fu style on earth. After fleeing to Hong Kong in 1949, he began teaching openly for the first time, eventually training Bruce Lee starting in 1957. But behind the disciplined public image was a man who spent years dependent on opium.
That habit, some students say, consumed most of the money he earned from teaching, forcing him to keep a steady stream of paying pupils just to fund it. He eventually broke the addiction, with help from those same students, but decades of heavy cigarette smoking took a toll that never reversed. In 1971, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He kept teaching as his health declined, leaning more on senior students to run daily classes. He died on December 2, 1972 in his small apartment on Tung Choi Street in Hong Kong at age 79, just 7 months before his most famous student would also be gone, a coincidence that has fueled speculation for decades even though the two men's illnesses were medically unrelated. Beyond Bruce Lee, Ip Man trained dozens of students who went on to found their own Wing Chun schools worldwide, cementing a lineage that today spans continents. His personal effects, letters, and training equipment are preserved in a small museum at the Foshan Ancestral Temple, a modest legacy for a man whose life was later reshaped into a series of heroic, mostly fictionalized action films that largely omit the addiction and illness that defined his final years entirely and completely. Bruce Lee's death remains one of the most picked apart in modern sports history. On May 10, 1973, 2 months before he died, Lee collapsed and seized at a Hong Kong studio. Doctors diagnosed cerebral edema and treated him with mannitol, and he recovered. On July 20, 1973, at actress Betty Ting Pei's apartment, he took a headache pill, complained of head pain, lay down, and never woke up. The inquest ruled death by misadventure, officially blaming a hypersensitive reaction to a compound in the painkiller equagesic. That explanation never satisfied everyone. Lee's 2018 biographer proposed heat stroke, tying it to a little-known fact. Lee had his underarm sweat glands surgically removed months earlier for cosmetic reasons, theoretically hampering his ability to cool down. In 2022, kidney specialists writing in Clinical Kidney Journal offered a third theory. They argued Lee's combination of heavy fluid intake, cannabis use, and possible diuretic effects pushed his sodium levels dangerously low, causing the fatal brain swelling through hypernatremia rather than any single drug reaction. No theory has been definitively proven, and the case remains actively debated by physicians decades later. At the time, wild rumors of gangland assassination and curses circulated through Hong Kong's film industry. They were fueled by Lee's sudden collapse at only 32, and the fact that he died in the apartment of a woman who was not his wife. Despite the controversy, Lee's brief filmography permanently changed how martial arts and Asian actors were portrayed in Western cinema. His influence on the genre only grew after his death, with his handful of completed films still studied by both martial artists and filmmakers today. Brandon Lee was 28 and one of the most promising young action stars in Hollywood when he died on the set of The Crow on March 31, 1993 in Wilmington, North Carolina. Investigators found the production had been using dummy cartridges, hollowed-out rounds with a bullet seated in them for close-up shots. One round's bullet had lodged in the barrel during an earlier scene. When the crew loaded blanks for the next take, nobody cleared the barrel first. Co-star Michael Massey fired the prop revolver from roughly 15 to 20 feet away, and the force of the blank drove the lodged bullet fragment into Lee's abdomen and into his spine. He survived 5 hours of emergency surgery before dying of internal bleeding and heart failure. Prosecutors ultimately found the death resulted from negligence and cutting corners on set safety, not intent, and filed no criminal charges. Investigators from OSHA specifically faulted the prop master for never verifying the dummy rounds and the assistant director for failing to clear the barrel between scenes. Lee's mother sued the production and settled out of court in 1994. The case pushed the industry towards stricter prop firearm protocols still cited decades later, including after the 2021 Rust shooting, when Lee's sister Shannon publicly renewed calls to eliminate functional prop guns from film sets altogether. Brandon Lee is buried beside his father at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle. The coincidence of two Lee men dying young and suddenly, decades apart, fed persistent talk of a Lee family curse that neither death actually supports on the evidence once the specific mechanical failures behind each are examined. Mitsuharu Misawa spent 2 decades as the face of Japanese King's Road Wrestling, a style built on absorbing brutal, real, head-first bumps rather than faking them. On June 13, 2009, in a tag match in Hiroshima, opponent Akitoshi Saito delivered what looked like a routine belly-to-back suplex. Misawa didn't get up. Told by the referee to move if he could, he said he couldn't, then lost consciousness seconds later.
A doctor pulled from the crowd performed chest compressions before paramedics arrived. He was pronounced dead at the hospital that night at age 46. The official police finding attributed death to a spinal cord injury triggering cardiac arrest, the cumulative result of the very style that made him famous. His family invoked Japanese privacy law to withhold further medical detail.
The match itself was officially stopped at the 27-minute mark, and Misawa was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital roughly 90 minutes after the injury occurred. The match was stopped. His promotion, Pro Wrestling Noah, never fully recovered financially, and Japanese wrestling saw a broader reckoning over head drop suplexes and how quickly referees should stop a match once a wrestler looks impaired.
Misawa had wrestled through a chronic neck injury for years leading up to that night, a detail many believe made the routine bump far more dangerous than it would have been for a healthier body. He remains, for many longtime fans and peers, one of the greatest in-ring performers the sport has ever produced, a legacy inseparable from the same physical toll that ultimately killed him, a tension that still shapes how Japanese promotions think about risk today.
Duk-Koo Kim traveled from South Korea to Las Vegas in November 1982 as a little-known challenger to lightweight champion Ray Boom Boom Mancini. What followed was one of the most brutal fights in boxing history. 14 rounds of sustained punishment, Kim absorbing dozens of unanswered blows in the latter rounds before the referee stopped it. He was carried out on a stretcher and rushed into emergency brain surgery to remove a blood clot. He never regained consciousness, dying 4 days later on November 18. The fallout went far beyond Kim himself. His mother died by suicide 3 months afterward, unable to bear the loss. The fight's referee, racked with guilt over not stopping it sooner, also took his own life. Mancini, devastated, canceled his next title defense, and by most accounts, was never quite the same fighter again. Within weeks, the WBC announced it was cutting championship fights from 15 rounds to 12. The WBA followed in 1987 and the IBF in 1988, permanently reshaping how championship boxing is scheduled to this day. Reporters visiting Kim before the fight noted he had written the phrase "live or die" in blood on his hotel bathroom mirror, a detail that took on grim weight only after his death. Kim had compiled a 29-4 amateur record before turning professional in 1978 and entered the bout as the WBA's top-ranked contender with a 17-1-1 professional record. His death remains one of the clearest examples in sports history of a single event forcing an entire industry to rewrite its own safety rules almost overnight, a shift that fighters today rarely think twice about. Evan Tanner, a former UFC middleweight champion known as much for his restless, searching personality as his fighting, rode his motorcycle alone into the desert west of Palo Verde, California in September 2008 on what he called a personal cleansing trip, the kind of solo excursion he'd taken many times before. Temperatures that week reached up to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. His bike ran out of gas, and he set out on foot to walk back toward camp carrying water that ran out before he could reach it. Friends grew worried when he stopped answering texts and reported him missing days later. A Marine helicopter spotted his body on September 8th, roughly 2 miles from his campsite, an empty water container beside him. The county coroner determined he had actually died days earlier, around September 4 or 5, from heat exposure and dehydration. He was 37, and his death became a cautionary story often cited in discussions of solo wilderness travel in extreme heat. A former high school wrestling state champion in Texas, Tanner had won the UFC middleweight title in 2005 and was known across the sport for a restless, adventurous streak that included solo motorcycle trips, scuba diving, and skydiving alongside his fighting career. Friends and former training partners later said the same fearless, self-reliant instincts that made him a compelling champion were the ones that ultimately put him alone in the desert, with no way to call for help, 140 miles from the nearest city, with no cell signal and no one else anywhere nearby to notice that something had gone terribly wrong. Kimbo Slice, born Kevin Ferguson, built his fame on viral backyard street fight videos before becoming one of the biggest draws in mixed martial arts. In February 2016, he won a bout against longtime rival Donna 5000, though it was later overturned to a no contest after Slice tested positive for elevated testosterone. Months later, on June 3rd, he checked into a Florida hospital complaining of abdominal pain, shortness of breath, and nausea. Doctors found congestive heart failure along with a mass on his liver and placed him on a ventilator in intensive care. As his condition worsened, physicians told his family he needed a heart transplant and arranged to transfer him to a Cleveland facility to be added to the donor list. He died on June 6th at age 42 before that transfer could happen. Investigators found no evidence of foul play or trauma, and the hospital's own report noted no history of drug use.
That left a serious, previously undiagnosed heart condition as the actual underlying cause. Slice had transitioned from viral internet fame into a genuine professional career across boxing, MMA, and even a stint on the reality show The Ultimate Fighter. He became one of the most recognizable faces the sport ever produced, despite a mixed record against elite competition. His sudden death at 42 shocked fellow fighters and fans alike, many of whom had no idea he was managing any underlying health problem at all. He had continued training and competing at a high level right up until his final hospitalization, giving no outward public sign whatsoever that anything was seriously wrong.
Andy Hug, the Swiss karate and kickboxing star nicknamed the Blue-Eyed Samurai, had just won his final professional fight on July 30th, 2000, when fatigue, unexplained bruising, and high fevers began setting in. Doctors in Tokyo diagnosed acute leukemia on August 17th, 2000, a fast-moving blood cancer that had likely been building undetected. He wrote to his fans that the illness was the toughest opponent he'd ever face, and that he intended to win. He didn't get the chance. On August 23rd, he slipped into a coma as his organs began failing, and the K1 organization made his illness public for the first time. He died the next day, August 24th, at age 35, roughly 22 hours after losing consciousness. Thousands of grieving fans gathered outside his memorial service at a Zurich cathedral, and K1 later named an annual tournament in his honor. Hug had been one of the promotion's biggest global stars, a three-time K1 Grand Prix finalist and world champion under multiple rule sets, famous for a spinning heel kick that became his signature finishing move. The speed of his decline, from a winning fight in July to a fatal diagnosis and death barely a month later, stunned a martial arts world that had regarded him as nearly indestructible, a man who had never shown any sign of slowing down in the ring. Ramon Dekkers, the Dutch Muay Thai fighter nicknamed the Diamond, was one of the first Western fighters ever respected as a genuine equal by Thailand's boxing establishment, racking up 186 wins in 224 professional fights and becoming the first non-Thai voted National Fighter of the Year. He had retired from competition years earlier and, a month before his death, had just received a royal honor from the King of Thailand recognizing his contribution to the sport. On February 27, 2013, while riding his bicycle through a tunnel in his hometown of Breda, he suddenly collapsed. Bystanders tried to revive him on the spot, and he was rushed to a nearby hospital, but doctors could not save him. He was pronounced dead of a heart attack at age 43, an unexpected end for a fighter widely regarded as one of the toughest and most durable competitors to ever step into a Muay Thai ring. Nicknamed the Turbine from Hell by the Thai press for his relentless, fast-paced style, Dekkers had gone on to coach and mentor younger fighters after retiring, and his death at a relatively young age, from heart attack during light exercise rather than in competition, struck much of the combat sports world as a cruel irony after a career built on absorbing far greater physical punishment without ever being seriously hurt in the ring itself. Benny Kid Parrott first won the welterweight title in 1960 by defeating Don Jordan. He and Emil Griffith then fought 3 times for that same title, trading the belt back and forth, and their rivalry had grown personal and bitter by the time they met for a 3rd time on March 24, 1962 at Madison Square Garden, broadcast live nationwide on ABC's Fight of the Week. In the 12th round, Griffith trapped Parrott against the ropes and landed a sustained barrage of unanswered punches before referee Ruby Goldstein finally stopped the fight. Parrott never regained consciousness and died in the hospital 10 days later on April 3rd at age 25 from brain hemorrhaging caused by the beating. The fight, witnessed live by millions of American television viewers, triggered public revulsion so severe that sponsors pulled their advertising from network boxing broadcasts, effectively ending boxing's decade-long run as regular network television programming and fueling political pushes for tighter regulation of the sport. Griffith, who won 5 world titles over his career, reportedly carried guilt over Parrett's death for the rest of his life. The fight is still cited by historians as one of the key moments that turned American public opinion against boxing as mainstream family entertainment. Parrott had already won and then lost the welterweight title against Griffith on 2 separate earlier occasions before their fatal 3rd meeting, making it one of the most personally charged rivalries in the sport's history, one that in the end was settled not by a 4th rematch, but by a funeral instead.